Stanford University.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to have you back in class. So I want to talk about food, and I want to start by talking about America's national foods. Here's our national foods: the hamburger, the hot dog, the French fry, and of course, ketchup. Now, as you all can tell from their names, hamburger, Frankfurter, French fries, that we can tell where they come from. We're a nation of immigrants, right? So here's Europe, and there's Hamburg. Okay, that's where hamburgers come from, and there's Frankfurt, and that's the French part. But what about ketchup, right? Ketchup, another American food. So ketchup, of course, is Chinese. And I brought you some samples here. We'll come back to some of them later, but here's my bottle of ketchup. So I don't know if you can read it all the way. What's the big letters say? Yeah, tomato ketchup, after the Heinz part. Yeah, the tomato ketchup. So why does it say tomato ketchup? Ketchup is made of tomatoes. Yeah, so language is logical, right? So if it says tomatoes, there must be a reason for saying tomatoes, and the natural reason is it didn't used to be made of tomatoes. So already the language is giving you a historical cue about the food and the object in general. So language is your key. So let me tell you a little story. So imagine you're now like 3000 BC, you live in Southeast Asia, maybe southern China. You're speaking, so the Chinese language hasn't moved down yet into that region. So you're speaking one of Mon Khmer or Tai Kadai or Hmong-Nan, these 3 language families in Southeast Asia, and you're preserving fish, right? You fish, either it's freshwater fish along the rivers or you're along the seacoast, and you got to preserve this fish through the dry season. So what do? Here's a method that actually hill tribes in the region still use. You take your fish and you put it in a basket and you put a bunch of fish, and then and salt, and a bunch of rice, and then fish, and then rice, and then fish, and you cover it, and you just go away for a few months. And when you come back, the fish has gotten all fermented. This is called lactic acid fermentation. This is something that I say that tribes still make, and that it was mentioned in the earliest Chinese writing about their neighbors to the south as they got there. So then, about 200 BC, the Chinese Empire expands south from the center, and it conquers all these areas. These areas are now what we call Fujian and Guangdong, Canton province, the south part of China. So those speakers are pushed south into Southeast Asia and up into the hill tribes of the south. And everybody still keeps making in the south this fermented seafood. And very quickly you start fermenting not just seafood, but soybeans, and so the ancestor of miso, these kind of fermented soybean paste arise. So first it was fish, then it was meat, then soybeans, and this spread around Asia. And another thing spread around Asia is that same fermented mix of rice and fish spread to Japan, where it was the ancestor of sushi. So it was an early version of sushi. It's called nare sushi in Japanese, where you actually ferment the fish and you ferment the rice. So you have this what we think of now as modern sushi, right? A fresh fish and a vinegar rice. Originally, that sourness came from the lactic acid of the fermentation. And so this change in the 18th century, they added vinegar and stopped fermenting things. And by the 19th century, we have refrigeration. It's possible to eat the fish fresh. All right, so that's the sushi cousin of ketchup. But meanwhile, back in Canton and Fujian, everybody is still using these fish pastes. So they're not very common in the north of China, but they're very common, sort of scattered throughout the south of China, and as we'll see in Southeast Asia. And also another paste made from fermented red rice wines, a yeast, kind of a microorganism you add to rice, and it creates liquor. And if you can ask me about that. We can talk about that later. So they're making a rice wine. So Fujian is cut off from the rest of China by mountains. Here's the beautiful mountains. So it's a sea coastal region. And so this is the region where all the big ships are built in China. This is the maritime Silk Road. In fact, the city of Quanzhou in Fujian had another name, Sitong, which may be our origin of the word satin. So this is where silk was sent out to the world. This is where Marco Polo came back from China to Europe via Persia. He sailed from Quanzhou, from the city in Fujian. And this is where the great treasure fleet of Zheng He, the treasure fleet that came as far west as Madagascar, went up to Persia and down to Madagascar, was built and sailed in this region. So lots of Chinese explorations and ships, lots of colonists were dropped. That's why there's ethnic Chinese throughout Southeast Asia and so on. So meanwhile, these Fujianese sailors who are Fujianese and Cantonese sailors from the south of China, they're sailing around to Southeast Asia, they're trading, they're bringing back the fish sauces that have become a specialty along the Mekong Delta, so the fish sauces of Vietnam and Thailand and so on. They're bringing them back to Fujian, and they're using this fermented red rice I talked about that they make wine, also to make dishes like fermented red rice chicken. It's very delicious. Here's a little map. This is Xiamen and Zhangzhou. These are the large cities in Fujian province, right on the coast, where these ships were built and people sailed from. And then here's the regions of Southeast Asia where the Chinese were sailing. So here's big colonies were on the island of Java and Indonesia and throughout Malaysia and in Cambodia and Bangkok, and you get the idea. So this is setting the setting. So now we're about 1600. We've got all these Chinese colonies here, and the Europeans arrive. So this is the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese. They're looking for porcelain. They're looking for spices. They're looking for textiles. What do they drink on these ships? You're a sailor on a ship. There's no fresh water. What do you bring from England? You bring wine and beer. But hops have not been invented yet. Well, the Dutch maybe have them, but the English don't have them yet. And hops are a way of making beer last longer. That's what an IPA is. It's a beer plus hops. So there's no hops. And these casks of wine aren't very well secured. So the wine goes bad, the beer goes sour. The poor sailors, they're drinking this terrible stuff. They get to Indonesia, and they find the ethnic Chinese living there are making something. They're making arak. And I have a bottle here. And you're welcome to sample it after. This is arak. Arak is an early ancestor of rum. It's made by distilling palm wine and palm sugar. So distillation was invented by the Chinese, was invented by the Arabs. Europe kind of has it by now, but only barely. And certainly distilled liquor is not known in England. So they get there and they say, oh, the locals, they have this weird hot beverage. So what's exciting about liquor is it doesn't go bad in the heat, right? And you can add it to water, it kills germs, it's great. This arak, and oh, you get drunk too. It's very good. So they're distributing this all the way throughout Asia. It's very popular, and the British Navy buys literally thousands of barrels of arak. It's the common drink of all of Europe. And in fact, I won't go into this, but this is how the cocktail was invented. So they take this arak and they add to it, this is what David Wondrich, the cocktail historian, thinks. They added the lemons they were keeping to avoid scurvy on the ships, and they just put that into the arak, and you get punch, which is the world's first cocktail. While they're there buying this arak, they buy some fish sauce because they're selling fish sauce. British food's probably pretty boring at the period, and they're great, something spicy. What's this fish sauce called in the local dialect of these Fujianese? Hokkien is the word in Fujian for Fujian. The local Chinese dialect, what's the fish sauce called? It's called ketchup or ketchup. Again, was an old word for salted fish. It's not used anymore in any of the dialects, and the character that used to mean salted fish now means salmon in some dialects. But jup is still the word for sauce in many southern Chinese dialects. It's the normal word for sauce, in fact, in Cantonese. So everybody in Hong Kong recognizes that ketchup is a Chinese word. All right, so the British bring home this ketchup, and it becomes an important commodity. So here's a great 1703 account of trading to India, by which they meant Asia at the time. And they talk a lot about how important fish sauce is, which they're still calling ketchup. So they say, you buy soy in tubs from Japan, and the best ketchup comes from Tonkin. Tonkin is northern Vietnam. So the best ketchup comes from Tonkin. It's a hint that this is fish sauce. But good of both sorts are made and sold very cheap in China. I know not a more profitable commodity. So they're making a lot of money buying ketchup and selling it at home. Ketchup, which means fish sauce, right? Not tomatoes yet, in England. And they also say, by the way, that they bring, he says, make sure when you're buying ketchup, you bring a lot of glass bottles west to China, and they fill the bottles with soy sauce and fish sauce, and they bring it home. Okay. And in fact, in modern Indonesian, ketchup is the word now for sauce. So also means any kind of sauce. The soy sauces, or there's a sweet sauce, or fish sauce, and so on. Okay, so the British are bringing this sauce home. But it's expensive, right? They're bringing bottles all the way to Asia. They're carrying the bottles back, filling them with sauce. What are you going to do when you have this expensive imported luxury product? Of course, you create fakes. So immediately there are fake ketchups. So first they were trying to make a ketchup that was a little bit like the original fish sauce. They made it out of anchovies. So here's a ketchup that will keep good 20 years. Remember, this is before refrigeration. The reason we're salting all these products is to keep them. So here's a lovely recipe. It's got cloves, it's got mace. You strain it, and it's even better than the original. That's what it says at the end. Even better. But there's other ways to make some kind of, this is a sauce that's high in glutamate. So fish sauce is umami, you know, the fifth taste umami is this kind of idea of salty glutamate tasting. And people start experimenting with other ingredients that have the same glutamate taste. So there is a mushroom ketchup, and then there's a walnut ketchup. Here's Jane Austen's family's recipe for walnut ketchup. So you take the walnuts and you pound them with salt, and you let them sit for 8 days, and you stir it constantly for 8 days. They had a lot of servants back in those days, and so on. And they add horseradish, and it doesn't sound that great actually, but somebody should try it. And then about 1800, tomatoes arrived from the New World. So tomatoes arrived from Mexico via Spain, maybe by the Jews, no one knows, up into England. And they got tomatoes, and so now here's a tomato and anchovy ketchup. So it's like again, salty, not like a modern ketchup, a salty anchovy tomato sauce. And then, was that a question?
Why did you, on the last slide, change to the other spelling of ketchup?
Oh, that's a great question. And feel free to stop me and ask questions. So, so 3 answers to that. One is spelling in English standardized very late. So there were lots of spellings of lots of words. But ketchup seemed to have many spellings from the very beginning. It has the ketchup with a K spelling, the ketchup with a C spelling, and actually a spelling we don't use anymore, like the English word catch and then up, C-A-T-C-H-U-P, was a common early spelling. So the short answer is that's a sign that we borrowed the word from a language without the Roman alphabet, because you know the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, they're all listening to some Hokkien speaker talking about this sauce, and they write it down in different ways. My guess is, we have no data on this, but my guess is the ketchup with a K spelling came through Dutch, because Dutch uses Ks, and the ketchup with a C spelling came through Portuguese, because C was used for that K sound. So like the word canton, spelled with a C, is actually Guangdong in Chinese. So it was a G sound, and that's how Portuguese would write a G sound.
Would be kind of a je in Portuguese.
Exactly. So ketchup, yeah. So that would be a Portuguese, that's my guess.
I didn't know they put cochineal in food stuff. I thought it was just a dye.
Yeah, it's shocking that they would use dyes for food. But I guess it's good to know that, it's a bug, yeah. Yeah, it's, I didn't know that either, but it's, I guess we now know that, the adulteration of food is not a modern problem. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a nice point. That's a nice point. And the little brandy at the end. Yes?
Is Worcestershire sauce related to one of these fakes?
Worcestershire sauce is another fake, but it's a fake not of a Chinese sauce, but of a Bengali sauce. So, and we don't know what the original sauce was. All we know is that later, this is like the 1800s now, maybe 150 years later, well, I guess about the time the tomatoes were added to ketchup, maybe 1850, a British chemist said, oh, I got this recipe from a noble person who brought it from, nobody knows who. So it's somebody's recipe from an English person in Bengal trying to approximate a Bengali sauce. And they, in fact, put soy sauce in it as one of their ingredients. So it's another attempt. You know, Asia was where the money is. That's where the expensive products came from. You try to imitate them. Okay, so we have tomato ketchup. Then anchovies seem to disappear by 1850. And by about 1870, sugar becomes cheap, especially after the Civil War in the US. And we add a lot of sugar, and we end up with our modern, which really kind of you think of modern ketchup as really a tomato chutney. It's really more of a chutney. It's a sweet and sour sauce. So not just a fact about words. I want to tell you that this has a implication for history. So here's how I was taught history, world history in high school. That in 1450, the Ming Dynasty, China turns inward, sinks the navy, stops trading with the world, and only later, maybe 100 years ago, is dragged into the world economy by Europe. So that's the story I was told. And so recent revisionist historians and the word ketchup shows you this is just not true. So basically, people just kept trading. The Chinese kept sailing and kept trading, even though it was illegal in China to sail. So historians like Andre Gunnar Frank have shown that if you just count the number of tons of goods carried on European versus Chinese ships, all the goods coming out of Asia were being carried on Chinese ships, and especially pirates. So there were, so the entire city of Xiamen, Amoy, that I showed you earlier, was completely controlled by pirates. So it was a very dangerous time to be alive. But Interestingly, it was less dangerous to be alive in China. So China had the highest lifespan, the highest per capita income, standard of living of the world. So 1700, so very late, and dominated the world economy. So all these reasons the Europeans were trying to go to Asia was it had textiles, it had clothing. This is where ceramics were made. Ceramics were, every dinner table had to have china on it. Where did china come from? China, hence the name. So, so they control all of this, and, and liquor too, right? Very important. But Europe didn't have manufacturing. The Industrial Revolution hadn't happened yet. So, so what they do is colonize America, find gold and silver mines, enslave people to work the silver mines, take the silver and gold, and go to China and buy groceries with it. So essentially, the drive for the China market, for ketchup, really, drove in the entire colonization process of the world. So hidden in the name of our national sauce, it's a story of globalization, centuries of economic domination, a world superpower, but it's not America. It's China, and it's not our century. It's another entire millennium. Okay, so so that's the story of ketchup, and I could tell you lots of other interesting historical stories, and maybe I'll tell you some, like how macaroni and macaroons were originally the same food, why turkeys are called turkey, and what it has to do with naval secrecy in the 16th century, and firecrackers, and why ice cream is in fact an adaptation of a military technology. So I'll come back to some of these depending if I have time, but I want to talk about something modern for a second. So I want to talk about the fact that language for food doesn't just tell you about history, it tells you about all sorts of modern things, social psychology, economics, linguistics, and we're going to look at language all over, there's language all around us, advertising, menus, restaurant reviews, so let's look at some of that. So I want to start by talking about my student Josh. So some of those of you who are younger at Stanford will have taken freshman seminars. So the freshman seminars are a thing now where big lecture halls are so huge that students don't get to meet professors one-on-one, so now they have freshman seminars. So every freshman gets a 12-person seminar, 12 students and a professor. They get a lot of research, they're actually doing research in their freshman year. It's very exciting. So I had a freshman seminar called The Language of Food, and Josh was one of the students, and he decided to look at the language on the back of potato chip bags. And being a freshman, he didn't want to buy any of these potato chip bags, so he took his camera to the local Safeway on the Menlo Park one, and he took pictures of the back of all the bags and brought it back to class, and we all looked at all the language on the back, and then we kept studying this for a couple of years afterwards, and here's what we found. So I'm going to read you, I brought my data set, some parts of it, here's some potato chips. And here's the sample. So we just typed in all of those words. That's our data. Okay, so I'll start with some sociology. So the famous French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, he said, in matters of taste, determination is negation. So what he means is, why do rich people like some things and poor people like other things? His idea was your social class determined what you like, partly because you chose what you liked to distinguish yourself from other people. Like we associate with our particular group, and we choose our taste to say, I'm part of this group and not part of that group. That what it is to have a taste, it doesn't matter objectively what your group is interested in, it's just that it's your group interested in, not that group. That's what he said. So he looked at French food in the 60s, taste in food and taste in music. So he finds there's a working class taste and there's a refined taste. So if you like Strauss, you're working class. If you like Bach, you're upper class. And if you're working class, you have heavy starchy meals. You have cassoulet, these big solid beans and sausage. And if you're high class, you borrow these new incoming foods. Curries and brown rice have come into France. And his idea was there's nothing better about cassoulet than curry. It's just, you're defining yourself by what you eat. Okay. So that suggests that the upper class especially is going to use language to say, we're not like the lower class, we're special, we're different. And so we hypothesized that these expensive potato chip bags, because there are expensive potato chips, would have different language than the cheap potato chip bags. And it would have language that specifically talked about comparing itself. We're different, we're better. So we looked at the linguistic idea of distinction. So we looked at comparatives, so literally linguistic comparatives, more or less, words ending in ER and EST, and lots of negation. We looked at words like no and not and never. And sure enough, all of these things are 5 times more frequent in the expensive chips. So unique, in a class of their own, best, not in any other chip. And lots of negation. No wiping your greasy chip hand, never fried, never baked, and so on. We don't wash out the natural potato flour. And in fact, every time you put a negative word on the bag, you're paying for it, so you can afford to pay for it. You're paying 4 more cents price per ounce. And I want to read you now, I put it on the screen too. This is the most expensive potato chip bag. This is Pop Chips. In terms of price per ounce. And I just want to read you some lovely negation. You can read along with me. Nothing fake or phony, no fake colors, no fake flavors, no fluorescent orange fingertips, no wiping your greasy chip hand on your jeans, no really. And it goes on. We don't bake it, we don't fry it, and so on. So tons of negation, and you're paying for that negation. Another fact we found on the bags was about health. So it turns out that potato chips are a health food. I'm sure you're aware of this. Every single bag talks a lot about health. They're healthier, there's no cholesterol, there's no sodium, but the more expensive the bag, the more likely to talk about health. So it's the expensive bags that talk about health. Or for example, nobody wants to have trans fats in their food, and none of the bags did. Like potato chips don't have trans fats in them because you don't want that. They're solid, right? But only the expensive bags said we don't have trans fats. So emphasizing that health is important to their consumers, which is the upper class consumers. All right, so that's potato chips. I want to talk about a totally different kind of data. I want to look at menus. So this is a collaboration with some friends at Carnegie Mellon and a student who just moved from Carnegie Mellon, Victor, this fall to Stanford. So we looked at, this is the computer science part of our project, we looked at 6,500 restaurants by getting their menus online, scraping them, which means just copying the words from the online copy of the menu, and so 5 million words, and looking at various things in the advertising. So for example, you could imagine if you're trying to sell an expensive product, you could do it in 2 ways. You could do what we call ostentatious advertising. You say, I'm great. That's ostentatious advertising. Or you could do modest advertising. You could say, I'm great. Or I'm kind of good. So that's called counter-signaling in the economics literature. And what we found was modesty. So the more expensive the restaurant, the fewer the dishes, the shorter the description of each dish was, less words, the fewer especially descriptive adjectives. So your words like crispy and golden brown and fresh, those occur only in the middle price restaurants. So the 2 little graphs on the right, the one on the top shows you $1, $2, $3, and $4 restaurants along the x-axis. And you can see that the number of mentions per menu of adjectives is really high in those $2, $3 restaurants. So it's the middle price restaurants that have these flowery descriptions. The expensive ones have very little. I want to give you an example of this. My wife Janet and I went to Cezanne, which is this fancy restaurant in San Francisco that just got a 3rd Michelin star. We went before that, so we have never been to a 3 Michelin star restaurant. Although they got it based on the month we were there, so that's okay. Yeah. Anyway, so so you might say, well, how's the menu look? And I went to see how the menu looked, but there is, in fact, no menu. So the more expensive restaurants now, there's no menu at all. So I asked them, please, is there a menu? And they mailed me the menu. This is the menu. I don't know if you can see it. I'll read it to you because you obviously can't read it. But you get the idea that it's not very extensive. The menu says caviar, goldeneye snapper, abalone, trout roe, sea urchin, cardoon, brassicas, toffee, wood pigeon, winter citrus, black walnut ice cream, and tea. So just one word for each dish, and kind of fancy words, right? Like they didn't say that there was cabbage as the 5th course. They said there was brassicas as the 5th course. Brassicas is just a name for it's just the Latin term for cabbage. So they're using fancy words. So let me talk about that. So the more expensive the restaurant, we found the longer the average word was. So they're using these very long words. The cheap restaurants are using short words, so they might say decaf instead of decaffeinated. The expensive restaurants have these so brassicas instead of cabbage. So you have long words, but you have short menus, and you don't have any of these words like fresh or crispy. And the idea is, why would it be that the expensive menus don't say that things are fresh? And there's a standard linguistic and economic game theoretic models for why this is. The idea is, if I say my food is fresh, language is logical. We say tomato ketchup because it was an informative thing to tell them that this wasn't the walnut ketchup that they used to have. So why do we say fresh? I say fresh to tell you that the food is not unfresh. And if you're worried the food is unfresh, that's a bad sign. Right? So if I'm convincing you the food's not fresh, then this is probably not in a fancy restaurant, you're paying for it to be fresh. So, so the idea is the expensive restaurants want you to presume things are great, and so they're going to signal that by counter-signaling. They're not going to tell you it's great. You're just going to assume it. Okay. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Another fun thing we found is that the cheaper the restaurant, the more the menus talked about you, the consumer, your choice, your way. The more expensive the restaurant, the more they talked about the chef. So they had words like chef selection and chef's choice. So the expensive restaurants, you're going, it's like going to the theater. The chef is going to do something for you, and it's all about, him or her. Whereas at the cheap restaurants, it's what you want that matters. We could even look at the price, not of the restaurant, but the individual dish. So we looked at all of these words like crispy and delicious. So they could be those kind of what I call appealing adjectives, or they could be words like generous or heaping, so words that just mean a lot of food, but they don't really, you can't sue them if they're not really generous, but they just say generous, so it's safe to say it on the menu. Or they could be just positive but vague, like delicious or tasty. It's not really clear what they mean, but they're positive. And sure enough, every time you have one of these words, the dish is cheaper. So you're paying 8 cents less if the word says delicious. If the dish says delicious, that dish will be 8 cents cheaper. And the presumption is that there's nothing that they have to say delicious because it isn't made of lobster or something really fancy that justifies a higher price. So they're going to make it cheaper and they're going to fill it out with the words. And the same thing. So if you say generous, it's going to be cheaper, and so on. Yes. Excellent question. We have a statistician. Great. So, so the question was, how are we normalizing across the menus? So we run, the thing we run is a regression, so a statistical regression. So we're predicting, the value we're predicting is the price of the item. And of course, you have to control for the fact that chicken is going to cost more than I don't know, a cup of coffee. So we have categories for the items in the regression. So you're predicting, given that this is chicken, and given that it's a $3 sign restaurant, and given that it's in New York City, can I predict from the words on the description what the price will be? So it's a regression predicting price from all these things after controlling for all these other factors. So yeah, exactly right. Control is important in these things. So we run these regressions with 1 billion controls is basically the answer. And we got good fits. Yes, yes, yes. I mean, these are not for a scientist, a magnitude of 3 cents per word is not that, a biologist would not be like, wow, 3 cents per word. But you're still paying 3 cents for those words. So they're there. Yeah. Other questions while I'm stopped?
Well, it actually relates to that. I'm thinking even if there are 10 of those words, it's 80 cents. And the difference between an expensive and an inexpensive restaurant is much more than 80 cents a dish. So I'm trying to figure out what this really is telling me.
Yeah, excellent. So this is not the big difference between Saison and, I brought you the menu for the Cheesecake Factory. And so first of all, the Cheesecake Factory, I'm not going to read you the menu because it's 20 pages. But yes, absolutely. So the biggest differentiator is what we call the dollar sign thing. There are really just different classes of restaurants that are completely different. This is a very minor thing that says even in addition to the restaurant's going to signal their expense by having a really long menu and all sorts of other things like that. And those are all factors in the regression that predict that a restaurant, from the menu, you can predict the class of the restaurant. These are smaller effects that on individual dishes say, even after you control for that, and now I'm just looking at Cheesecake Factory type restaurants, if they start putting the word generous or heaping on a dish, they're going to be charging less for it. And so it means that those dishes are the ones that don't have anything else good to say about them, and they stuck in the word generous. So you're exactly right, that these are not huge effects. The huge effects are Saison has all these other things that many of which aren't on the menu because there is no menu, so I can't even look at them.
So one follow-up on that. There are people who make their living writing menus. Have you talked
I have. So I've talked to some restaurateurs and I've asked them what they do. I was on a panel with the Fat Duck Chefs, which is this fancy restaurant in England. And I asked them who wrote the menus and how they decide these things. And they said that the fancy restaurants have menu consultants. So they're design people. They design the menu, including some of the words. But the chef mix up some of the words. The owner will stick words in. So they're clearly, I mean, as a linguist, all believe that people are incredibly good language users, right? That language doesn't happen by accident. That we've overlearned basically to use language. So I'm convinced that anything that's on the menu is there on purpose. There's enough people who look, now there's accidents and there's, they were in a hurry that day and the menu just rushed out, or some restaurants really just don't have anybody and they scrawl it in a hurry. But most of the time when we use language, we do so intelligently and with purpose. So my guess is that these are signals that the writer of the menu subconsciously or consciously knows which audience they're trying to attract, and they're using the words intelligently to appeal to that audience. And I think to the extent that I've read, there's like 2 textbooks on how to write menus, and they mostly focus not on this kind of stuff, but they focus on placement. Like upper right-hand corner is where people look first. You go put stuff on the bottom if you want to put something that's cheap that you have to have in the menu, but you don't want them to order. You put that. So placement is really big, but the language matters too. In fact, I looked at a menu writer's guide from the 70s, and there what they said was continentalize your menu. So it was big in the 60s and 70s was French words. So you had like le crab cake cocktail and crab meat cocktail and so on. So you'd stuck le into things. That was just the way you indicated expense in the 70s.
How do you reconcile the concept that people are using language carefully in menus with what I've noticed, which is there are an awful lot of typos in menus. And and these I'm not talking about ones that are just typed for the day, ones that they printed multiple times.
It's true.
I mean, what's with that?
It's true. So there's a difference between being that we're overlearned in language use and having copy editors. This in my the book that I'm talking that some of these things are in. It's still, it had me, it had 2 copy editors, it had an agent and an editor, and there's still typos in it. So yeah, typos, it's just true. And it's very annoying. I'm with you on that.
How do you compare the stuff that's on the menu versus the person who's standing there rattling off all the specials?
Yeah, no, that's great. And so basically the short answer is, like any social scientist, I look under the lamppost. So the data I have, all I have is the menus. But it would be great to instead be able to tape people and see how that differs. If I was a restaurateur and if I was an economist studying what worked, what actually made people buy things more, I would definitely need to get a microphone into the place and study what people say. So there's been a couple of economists who've studied in practice in a restaurant what helps if you So if you add the word crispy to something, will people pay more for it? And the short answer, there was one experiment done at Cornell in Brian Wansing's lab, and they found that adding the word crispy, or they called them something else, but these kind of appealing adjectives, made people more likely to order a dish, but they wouldn't pay a penny more for it. So people are not stupid, which is also good to know. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Would you think that perhaps part of the difference between the short, expensive menu and the longer, inexpensive menu is that if you're coming into this expensive restaurant, you're supposed to know what this stuff is in the first place, and you don't need a large, grand definition?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a factor. Either that you're supposed to know, or that it's part of the mystique of the restaurant that they use a fancy word that even if you don't know, you feel guilty for not knowing, and it shows that they're smart and they're fancy. That's definitely part of it. But part of it's also just a cultural, a cycle. Fancy restaurants did have long menus 100 years ago. So I feel like this trend toward minimalism is kind of a modern trend. Fancy restaurants in 1960 did have long menus. So I think that's been a change.
Having been a waiter at a very fancy restaurant,
Nice.
I think part of it is also the theater of it. So the less you have on the menu, the more you can explain to your guests and hopefully create an atmosphere where they like the food and purchase more.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think it's a sensible decision.
Yeah, the other thing is that when you go into menu, there's a lot of things on the menu, and a waitress, gives you a few items that are specials. The assumption is that those are the fresh things, and the other things are in the freezer somewhere.
But it may be the other way around. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you heard it. He said that when the waitress gives you a list of specials, the assumption is that those are the fresh things, and it's the other stuff that's frozen. And of course, it may be the other way around, and depends on the restaurant.
Yeah, the question is,
So
right?
Yeah.
it used to be, I would go, a menu might say olives.
Yeah.
And then they started saying things like Kalamata olives
Yes.
and all that. I don't know if that is a reflection of people's attention to the ingredients and they're changing the ingredients, or was it this thing of by being fancy?
So I'm so glad you asked that.
Olives.
I'm so glad you asked that. I have a slide on that. I love it when people ask things I have a slide for. We looked, for example, at this thing called authenticity. Let me just show you. So authenticity is huge. All these marketing things are talking about authenticity. I took some quotes from the New York Times, like everything's about being authentic. And so we asked, we looked at both potato chips and menus. Is there a difference in kinds of authenticity? And so we looked at two kinds of authenticity. And so one is you're authentic by being family and tradition and having been a restaurant for a long time and having a founder. And then you're authentic by eating natural food where you know which farm it came from and the provenance is very important. And so, for example, if you look at expensive restaurants are 15 times more likely to talk about where the food comes from. So it's not exactly the same as Kalamata olives, but they'll say that it's heirloom or that it's local or the name of the farm or maybe the variety that it comes from. So this is clearly a mark right now of being an expensive restaurant, is to talk about where the food comes from. And I've noticed that that's beginning to now, so sociologists like Veblen, who was at Stanford, and Simmel said in the early 20th century that new innovations come in with the upper class because they can afford some exotic foreign thing, and then they trickle down very quickly to the middle class and everyday people. And you saw that with ketchup, right? Ketchup isn't all everyday food, but was originally this exotic import. And I think this idea that people caring about where their food came from started with people who could afford to care, and now I think you're going to see it in McDonald's and Taco Bell. They'll tell you at some point, where the food comes from. For example, if you mention the word exotic, the menus that say that charge more. Because if you're saying something is exotic, it means you're selling it to non-native eaters, right? To an Ethiopian food is not exotic. So that means you're selling, if you say the word exotic, you're selling it to non-native eaters who are presumably going to pay more for it. All right, I want to move on to two more studies. I'll do one very briefly, and then I'll finish on a last one. So this is another study with the same co-authors, and this one is on restaurant reviews. So here I've printed you a negative restaurant review, and then I put little samples of pieces from different positive reviews. So just to give you a second to look at some of the negative and positive reviews. The negative review, let's start with the negative review. So I want you to notice the fact that the food is not mentioned at all. So you might imagine that a negative review of a restaurant is saying the restaurant has bad food. That would be what you would logically think. But there's nothing about the food at all. This is clearly about service, right? It's clear, the waitress and so on. So we asked, what makes a restaurant review bad? Can we predict what, in the language of the review, is reflective of this 1 star? We looked at the 1-star reviews on Yelp. And here's what we found. Lots of, as you might expect, negative words like horrible and terrible and awful. Lots of what linguists call narrative genre, meaning they use the past tense, they use third-person pronouns like he and she, and they mention a lot of other people, so managers and customers and waiters and maitre d's, and this very curious large number of mentions of the words we or us, much more than you'd expect by chance. So what kind of language has negative sentiment, our past tense narratives, and talk about we or us a lot? It turns out other social psychologists and linguists have looked at different kinds of genres and found a genre exactly like this. It is the genre of trauma narratives. So people on the chat groups after Princess Diana died, or who are blogging after 9/11, or who, this is a Texas, there was a fire in Texas and students died and they were talking about it in the paper afterwards. They all use exactly the same language. Negative words, past tense, lots of mentions of people and pronouns, and especially lots of use of we and us. And the logic is that you're seeking solace in your community. This bad thing happened, but it happened to us as a group, not just me. And we see this exactly in the review. So people go to the restaurant, the waitress is rude, the waiter is rude, and instead of in the review saying he was rude to me, they say she was rude to us. So even though you might say us in the normal course of things, you're much more likely to say it when you're talking about this traumatic thing. So you might think that the language of food, of reviews here, is just about the food, but it's in fact a very clear indicator of people's social, psychological state as they're writing the reviews. Positive reviews, so we talked a lot, I showed you that example with all that, the sex. So yeah, that's my favorite. Very naughty, I couldn't fit it. Very naughty, deep-fried pork belly was the original. And sure enough, the more expensive the restaurant, the more you talk about sex. The cheaper the restaurant, instead, you talk about craving and crack and addiction and drugs. And the graph is very clear. So the cheaper the restaurant, the more we talk about the food as a drug. So why? Why do we talk about food, cheap food as a drug? Why this addiction narrative? And we looked at what foods that's applied to, and it tends to be junk foods. So it's your chicken wings, your French fries. So you're feeling guilty, you're eating this unhealthy food, you're feeling guilty, and by talking about it as a drug, you're saying, well, it wasn't my fault I ate it, right? I'm addicted to it. There's this external agent, the food as drug, forcing me to eat it. I had no control. And interestingly, women use this metaphor more often than men. And that's consistent with other researchers who've looked at how women talk about eating chocolate and things in America. So it's basically, the assumption is that women more than men are pressured to eat healthy, and so by talking about your eating of non-normative food as a craving, so you're sort of saying, you're distancing yourself from the action that you took in eating it, and it's a little easier to deal with. I want to talk about one last thing with reviews, which is dessert. So here's the words people most often use when talking about dessert. You'll notice that none of them are negative. In fact, they're all quite positive. So nobody hates dessert. And maybe, okay, my mom could have told me that, but it's actually actionable. Like the Yelp reviews, if they mention dessert, are 0.3 points higher out of 5 than reviews that don't. So my advice to restaurateurs is to make sure you have enough desserts. So I want to take the last 5 minutes, and I want to give you some time for questions at the end. I want to do one last thing. I want to talk about Shakespeare and philosophy. So conventionalism is the idea that Juliet expresses in Romeo and Juliet. So what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So the name doesn't matter for the object. Names are just arbitrary things. They're conventional. We just happen to call rose rose. If we called a rose something else, it wouldn't matter. There's an alternative to this, actually, called naturalism, and Plato talks about this in one of his dialogues in the Cratylus. He says, this is the idea that there's an inherently correct name for everything in all languages. By all languages, he meant Greeks and barbarians, but he meant all languages. So an inherently correct name, and it turns out there's actually, naturalism sounds kooky, right? Like, if you call it a rose, it doesn't matter what lots of languages call it different things. Naturalism can't, in the strong sense, be true. But it turns out in the weak sense, there is evidence for naturalism, and I want to talk about that in food. So I want to talk about two kinds of vowels, front vowels and back vowels. So, and I've shown kind of a picture of the tongue, where the tongue is for different kind of vowels. So front vowels are vowels like I, E, E. So that's teeny, thin, and checks. So maybe look at my mouth, teeny, thin, and checks. See, I'm kind of like, my mouth goes wide, teeny, thin, and checks. And then back vowels are the ones where the tongue's in the back of the mouth. So that's your bold, coarse, large. So there's ahs, aws, and ohs. The tongue is more in the back of the mouth. So it turns out that there are properties of front and back vowels, and we call them sound symbolic properties, sound symbolism. So front vowels across lots of languages are used for little things. So in English, we have little, has an I in it. Teeny, teeny weeny, itsy bitsy. All those have I and E vowels, and it's true in lots of other languages. So French petite has the E vowel, and back vowels tend to be used for big things. So you have your, and there's a typo. Humongous, huge, large. So your large things have these ah vowels. Humongous, huge, large. Okay. So, and again, cross-linguistically, this tendency. Not every word, of course, in every language, but in every language, this is true statistically. So it's statistically true that words for small things, in English, the name you use for a little kid at the end to, if instead of calling your kid Dan, you could call them Danny. It's an E, and that E is very common across linguistically, that the word for little kids has the E vowel in it, and so on. Okay, so do food names reflect this sound symbolism? So here's a hypothesis. Cracker names will use front vowels because you want crackers to be little and small and delicate. And ice cream names will use back vowels because you want them to be rich and heavy and solid. And so I studied this by going to the web and scraping some cracker brand names, 600 cracker brand names, and looking at all the flavors of the day I picked it from Haagen-Dazs and Ben & Jerry's, so 81 flavors, and just looking at the vowels in the cracker names and the vowels in the ice cream. I've got you some more data sets here. Okay, so I want you to pronounce these with me. Ritz, okay. Triscuit Thin Crisps, okay. Wheat Thins, thank you. Feel your mouth widening? Okay, chicken in a biscuit. So lots of is and e's. And sure enough, this is what we found. Ice cream flavors have a lot of ahs, Rocky Road, Jamocha Almond Fudge, chocolate, caramel, lots of ahs. And cracker names have a ton of is and e's. And if you do the correct statistics, which is you count the number of vowels in each after controlling for the number of vowels in English in general in words, you get this really actually beautiful pattern, so beautiful that it's almost like suspicious. But it's real, I promise. That front vowels, that crackers are much more likely to have front vowels, and ice cream is much more likely to have back vowels. So why is this? Why are front vowels small and why are back vowels big? A standard explanation is that front vowels have a particular kind of high pitch to them. It's called the formant. You think about it as the tongue is in the front of the mouth, making a little tiny space in front, and small spaces have little tiny waveforms that fit in them, and little waveforms are high frequency. So intuitively, that makes sense because high pitches are made, in fact, by small animals. So, birds have a high-pitched chirp, lions have a low roar, and back vowels, again, have a lower pitch to them. So there's something about pitch that's explaining this. And I'm going to skip over a few more things. Well, maybe I'll talk about them. I have just enough time. Here's two words. Here's two pictures, and I want you to give me the Martian names for them. And the Martian word is either, one of them is called Booba, and one of them is called Kiki. So which one's Kiki? Left, okay. Which one's, and how about the same thing with, one's called Maluma, and one's called Takete. Takete's on the left, right? So everybody says this across all languages. Something about roundy, curvy figures that sound like Booba or Maluma. We're not going there. We're not going there. And there's something about spiky figures that sounds like, even if you, like Maluma's safer, right? Okay. So, or spiky figures that sound like Kiki. So why is this? So there's a food link. So this is Charles Spence's lab at Oxford. So they looked at dark chocolate versus milk chocolate, and the same thing, the dark chocolate, Takete, the milk chocolate, Maluma. Or he looked at carbonated beverages versus still beverages. Carbonated beverages are Takete, the still is Maluma. And in fact, in the cracker and ice cream data, ice creams have more L's and M's in them. Crackers have more T's and K's in them. So it seems like M and L sounds are associated with creamier, gentler taste, and T and K with these bitter, sharp taste. And here's a sound wave of me saying Maluma and Takete. And so Maluma is continuously air flowing out of your mouth when you say it. So you can try saying it yourself. Maluma. You can put your hand on Maluma. There's sound coming out the whole time. Takete is every time you say a T or a K, you actually stop, your tongue stops the sound from coming out, your air pressure builds up behind the tongue, you drop your tongue, and the air spikes out. You can see the spikes in the waveforms there. Takete, each of those, you can takete, you can feel the puff of air after each one. So the actual sound acoustically is smoother for this one and non-continuous for that one. So the idea of synesthesia says that different senses are somehow perceptually related. So we're hearing acoustic smoothness, and somehow that's linked to vision, so we naturally associate it with curvy, smooth acoustics with curvy figures, and jagged acoustics with jagged figures, and somehow in the taste, too, something about creamy and sharp taste. So I want to talk about the evolutionary implications of both of these things. So let's go back to the smiling. So I pointed out that smiling, those E vowels, are related to smiles. They're E, I, I'm widening my mouth and making a smile. So that's why we say cheese for taking pictures, the E vowel forces you to widen your mouth. Your tongue's in the front, you're widening your mouth. And it somehow makes us sound smaller. And there are these hypotheses that the reason smiles evolved was, when you have two animals confronting each other, one of them smiles to mean, I'm small, I'm going to make little squeaky sounds, don't hurt me. I'm not dangerous. So smiling evolved to appease, in fights. Going back to Maluma and Takete, how did language evolve? This is a big question for linguists. I want to end on this one. How does the first listener know what the first speaker is talking about? I think of this as bootstrapping. So this is the first cave woman to figure out how to talk. How do they say something that the first caveman is going to understand? She says E to mean baby because E is kind of high-pitched. Or she says ah or oh to mean big because those have a low pitch. Or she says ki to mean something sharp because it has an acoustic sharpness. So this may have helped, originally to bootstrap language, and then later you sort of get this conventionalism and we sort of memorize words. But at the beginning, this may have been a way that language evolved. So I want to stop. So we're basically surrounded by the language of food. This data is everywhere. This is kind of the idea of all this modern social science and humanities looking at big data. The idea of big data is not that it's big. It's that it's okay to look all around us in the natural world for data. That you don't have to put people in a lab in an experiment to study them. That we should be studying humans in their natural setting. And we're surrounded. Look at all that data. It's great. And then you can eat it afterwards. It's all good. So we can learn about all sorts of things. We can learn about psychology, we can learn about economics, we can learn about linguistics, and even evolution. And so I hope you go forth and read your packages really carefully from now on.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.